The Vietnam War, shadows of fire and thunder. The roots of fire. Logic and proportion had fallen away. The world itself seemed inverted. And in that inversion, America marched headlong into a war it could not name and would never truly understand. A land of endless struggle, Vietnam. A thin crescent of land curving along the eastern edge of Indochina, bordered by China to the north, Laos and Cambodia to the west, and the South China Sea to the east. It was a country shaped as much by its geography as by its history. To the north lay the fertile Red River Delta, cradle of ancient kingdoms. To the south, the broad and swampy Mekong, a land of rice paddies and waterways. Between them stretched jungles, mountains, and coastal plains, a natural corridor for traders, conquerors, and armies. For 2,000 years, Vietnam's people endured waves of foreign invasion. Chinese dynasties, Mongol horsemen, and later the French would all impose their rule. Each time, the Vietnamese resisted. Each time, they endured. Resistance became not just politics, but a way of life, woven into the national identity. The Kham people, maritime warriors from Borneo, carved out kingdoms along the coast, erecting Hindu temples that still stand in ruins. The Khmers of Cambodia pushed northward, settling in the Mekong Basin. And at the center of it all, the Vietnamese people, emerging from centuries of Chinese domination, hardened into a nation defined by survival. Here, history was not gentle. It was a constant negotiation between the weak and the strong, between the invader and the native. The arrival of the West. By the 17th century, the wines of Europe reached Vietnam's shores. Portuguese merchants dropped anchor, their cannons bristling over wooden decks. Dutch traders followed, hungry for spice and silk. But it was the French who lingered longest. Missionaries arrived carrying the crucifix, intent on spreading Christianity. Among them was Alexandre de Rhodes, a Jesuit priest whose work would forever change the Vietnamese language. By adapting the Roman alphabet to the sounds of Vietnamese, he laid the foundation for modern QUCNG. But faith and empire walked hand in hand. When Vietnamese rulers, fearing foreign influence, executed missionaries, France seized upon the killings as a pretext for intervention. By 1858, French warships were bombarding Da Nang. Saigon fell within years. And by the end of the century, Vietnam was absorbed into French Indochina, ruled not as a partner, but as a possession. The weight of empire. French colonialism brought railways, rubber plantations, and administrative reforms, but at staggering cost. Vietnam was divided into three entities: Tonkin in the north, Annam in the center, and Cochin China in the south. Saigon was transformed into a colonial jewel. French villas lined broad boulevards. Cafes and theaters echoed with European music. For a small Vietnamese elite, French education was the ticket to prestige. For the vast majority, it was exclusion and resentment. Peasants lost their ancestral lands to wealthy landlords and foreign companies. Taxes increased, forced labor was imposed, and countless Vietnamese were drafted to work in rubber plantations under brutal conditions. Rice, once a staple, became an export. Famines haunted villages, while colonial warehouses filled with grain bound for Europe. Colonial power was absolute, but beneath the surface, discontent simmered. A revolutionary is born. It was in this world of exploitation and humiliation that a boy named Nguyen Sinh Cung was born in 1890 in a small village in central Vietnam. He would later take the name Ho Chi Minh. Brilliant and restless, Ho left his homeland as a young man, traveling first as a cook's assistant on a French steamer. From New York to London, Paris to Moscow, he absorbed the world. In Harlem, he saw racial inequality. In Paris, he encountered socialism and later communism. He saw in these ideologies not abstract theory, but a weapon, a means to free his country from the shackles of empire. In 1919, at the Versailles Peace Conference, Ho petitioned for Vietnamese independence. His request was ignored. To the Allied leaders, he was invisible. That rejection would shape him forever. The war within the war. During World War I, Japan swept into Indochina, exploiting the colony's resources for its war machine. French officials collaborated, while ordinary Vietnamese endured famine that killed up to 2 million. In the chaos, Ho returned. With General Vo Nguyen Giap, he formed the Viet Minh, a nationalist resistance movement fighting for independence. Ironically, Ho's forces found unlikely allies in the Americans. The OSS, the predecessor of the CIA, provided the Viet Minh with training, weapons, and supplies. Viet Minh guerrillas rescued downed U.S. pilots, earning cautious goodwill. When Japan surrendered in 1945, a power vacuum opened. On September 2nd, in Hanoi Ba Dinh Square, Ho Chi Minh declared Vietnam's independence, quoting the American Declaration of Independence, "All men are created equal." Tens of thousands cheered. For a moment, it seemed history had turned. But independence would not come so easily. France returns. Determined to restore its empire, France reasserted control. Backed by American funding, desperate to contain communism, French troops marched into Vietnam once more. Ho Chi Viet Minh fought a brutal guerrilla war in jungles and villages. For the French, it was a war to re-establish colonial pride. For the Vietnamese, it was a war of survival. 8 long years followed. Villages burned. Rice fields became battlefields. French foreign legionnaires patrolled through dense jungles, their bright kepis dulled by mud. The French fought with modern weapons and artillery. The Viet Minh fought with ingenuity, determination, and the support of peasants who saw them as defenders of the homeland. Dien Bien Phu, the death of empire. In 1954, the French made a fateful decision. At a remote valley called Dien Bien Phu, they built a fortified base, believing its artillery superiority would crush the Viet Minh. They were wrong. General Vo Nguyen Giap orchestrated one of the most extraordinary campaigns in modern military history. Tens of thousands of Viet Minh troops dragged artillery up jungle-clad mountains by hand, piece by piece. Trenches and tunnels snaked toward French positions. For 55 days, the siege raged. French forces, cut off and battered, withered under relentless assault. On May 7, 1954, Dien Bien Phu fell. It was the death knell of French colonialism in Asia. A nation divided. The Geneva Conference that followed divided Vietnam at the 17th parallel. North Vietnam, the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, under Ho Chi Minh. South Vietnam, backed by the United States, led by Ngo Dinh Diem, a Catholic nationalist with little grassroots support. The agreement promised nationwide elections within 2 years. But Washington, fearing Ho Chi's inevitable victory, ensured they never took place. Vietnam was not truly divided by culture or history. It was divided by the Cold War. And in Washington's eyes, the stakes were global. The domino theory. American policymakers believed that if Vietnam fell to communism, so too would Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, and perhaps all of Southeast Asia. The image was one of dominoes, collapsing one by one. Better, they reasoned, to intervene early, to stop the spread. But this was not Vietnam's logic. It was America's. A projection of its own fears onto a country it barely understood. The stage was set for tragedy. Centuries of conquest had forged in Vietnam a culture of resistance. Empires had come and gone. Chinese, Mongol, French, Japanese, yet the people endured. But now, a new power was watching, calculating, preparing to step into the shadows left by France. For America, Vietnam was not just a distant land. It was the battleground of the Cold War, the test of a generation. And soon, its jungles and rivers would be filled not with the march of peasants or the tread of legionnaires, but with the boots of American soldiers. The Vietnam War, shadows of fire and thunder. The American crucible after the guns fell silent at Dien Bien Phu. The torch of empire did not go out, it merely passed hands. Where France had failed, America believed it could succeed. For in Washington's eyes, Vietnam was no longer just a colony. It was the battlefield of the future, a proving ground in the struggle between freedom and communism. The shadow of Geneva, the ink was barely dry on the Geneva Accords when American policymakers began to doubt them. The agreement promised elections in 1956 to unify Vietnam. But intelligence reports, and America's own advisors, confirmed what everyone already knew: Ho Chi Minh would win. President Dwight D. Eisenhower admitted it openly in his memoirs years later. Ho Chi Minh would have received 80% of the vote. But America could not allow that outcome. To cede Vietnam to communism would, they believed, trigger the collapse of all Southeast Asia. Thus was born the domino theory, the conviction that nations fell to communism like falling dominoes, each toppling the next. Instead of elections, Washington built a new state in the South, a bulwark, they hoped, against the red tide. Ngo Dinh Diem. The mandate of America into this fragile moment stepped Ngo Dinh Diem, a rigid Catholic nationalist from a prominent family. Diem had lived abroad in the United States, cultivating relationships with Catholic leaders, journalists, and policymakers. He was charismatic in Washington's halls, stubborn on Vietnam soil. For America, Diem was ideal, anti-communist, devout, Western-educated. For many Vietnamese, he was alien. In a land where 80% of the population was Buddhist, his Catholic faith marked him as an outsider. His reliance on family members, his brother Ngo Dinh Nhu, his sister-in-law Madame and Hu, created a regime that was insular, authoritarian, and suspicious of its own people. Yet with American dollars and military advisors, Diem consolidated power. The Army of the Republic of Vietnam (ARV) was built from the ground up, supplied with American weapons, trained by American officers. Saigon became the seat of a government that claimed to be democratic, but functioned as an autocracy. Seeds of resistance in the north, Ho Chi Minh's government consolidated power, redistributing land and building loyalty among peasants. In the south, resistance began to stir. Former Viet Minh fighters, disillusioned peasants, and nationalists excluded from Diem's rule began to organize. By 1960, this resistance would coalesce into the National Liberation Front (NLF), known to Americans as the Viet Cong. At first, they were small bands of guerrillas, striking at isolated posts, ambushing convoys, intimidating officials. But behind them lay a network of support, villages providing food, families sheltering fighters, northern cadres funneling supplies along jungle trails that would one day be called the Ho Chi Minh Trail. For Diem and for Washington, it was a problem that would only grow. America's expanding role initially, America's role in Vietnam was limited. Eisenhower sent military advisors, economic aid, and CIA operatives. Their mission was not to fight, but to build, to strengthen South Vietnam's army, economy, and political system. But advisors soon realized that what they were building was fragile. Corruption seeped through the government. Soldiers were loyal to their commanders, not the nation. Villages distrusted Saigon as much as Hanoi. By 1960, 900 U.S. military advisors were in Vietnam. By 1963, that number would swell to more than 16,000. America was no longer a distant sponsor. It was becoming a participant. The Kennedy years. John F. Kennedy inherited Vietnam in 1961. Young, charismatic, and haunted by the specter of Cold War defeat, Kennedy viewed Vietnam as a test of credibility. The Bay of Pigs fiasco had embarrassed America. The Berlin Wall divided Europe. The Cuban Missile Crisis had brought the world to the brink. Vietnam, Kennedy believed, was a place to demonstrate American resolve. But Kennedy was cautious. He resisted sending combat troops, preferring instead to expand the advisory mission. Helicopters, Green Berets, and new counterinsurgency tactics were introduced. Strategic hamlet programs attempted to isolate villages from guerrilla influence, relocating peasants into fortified compounds. The theory was simple: cut off the fish from the sea. The reality was chaos. Families resented being uprooted. Hamlets became targets. The program, meant to isolate the insurgency, instead deepened hostility toward Diem's regime. The Buddhist crisis. By 1963, Diem's rule was unraveling. His government, dominated by Catholic elites, marginalized the Buddhist majority. Tensions exploded in May when government troops opened fire on Buddhist protesters in Hue, killing 9. Images of repression spread quickly. Monks began a campaign of nonviolent protest. The world was shocked when, on June 11, 1963, Thi Kung Si, a Buddhist monk, sat calmly in the middle of a Saigon intersection, poured gasoline over his body, and set himself ablaze. Photographs of his self-immolation spread around the globe, searing into the conscience of the world. Diem's sister-in-law, Madame Nhu, dismissed it coldly as a barbecue. For Washington, it was a turning point. America had invested heavily in Diem, but his regime was now a liability. The question was no longer whether to support him, but how to replace him. The coup. In the summer of 1963, whispers of coup plotting grew louder. American officials, divided and conflicted, debated whether to back a military overthrow. Some warned of chaos. Others argued that Diem's repression made him unsalvageable. On November 1, 1963, South Vietnamese generals struck. With tacit American approval, they surrounded Diem's palace. Diem and his brother New attempted to flee but were captured. Hours later, they were executed in the back of an armored personnel carrier. Kennedy was informed at the White House. Reports say he was visibly shaken. He had approved support for a coup, but not for murder. Still, the deed was done. The man America had built as the cornerstone of South Vietnam was gone. The nation was leaderless, unstable, fragile. A fateful November. Just 3 weeks later, in Dallas, Texas, John F. Kennedy was assassinated. The leadership of America, like that of South Vietnam, had been violently upended. Kennedy had been hesitant, cautious, skeptical of a large-scale commitment. His successor, Lyndon B. Johnson, would inherit a fragile situation and an escalating war. Where Kennedy had hesitated, Johnson would plunge forward. In less than a decade, Vietnam had transformed from a French colony to a divided nation, from a forgotten corner of Asia to the front line of the Cold War. America's presence, once advisory, now loomed larger with each passing month. The fall of Ngo Dinh Diem marked not stability, but fracture. And with Kennedy's death, the decisions ahead would be left to a man determined never to lose, yet blind to the true cost of winning. In the jungles and rice paddies of Vietnam, the storm was gathering. The thunder had not yet struck, but it was coming. By the mid-1960s, Vietnam was no longer a distant concern whispered in Washington. It was a cauldron, a crucible, a war consuming lives, shaping futures, and testing the limits of American resolve. For President Lyndon B. Johnson, the situation was urgent. He inherited a country in chaos, a fragile ally in Saigon, and an adversary, Ho Chi Minh, whose vision extended far beyond the boundaries of the Mekong Delta. On August 2, 1964, the USS Maddox, a U.S. Navy destroyer, was on routine patrol in the Gulf of Tonkin. Reports arrived. North Vietnamese torpedo boats had allegedly fired upon the Maddox. Hours later, reports of a second attack surfaced, though evidence would later suggest it never occurred. Johnson seized the moment. To him, this was more than a skirmish, it was a clarion call. Congress swiftly passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, granting Johnson broad authority to escalate the conflict. With a single stroke, America's role transformed from advisory support to active military engagement. Operation Rolling Thunder began in 1965, a massive aerial bombardment intended to cripple North Vietnam, cut off supply lines, and demonstrate American resolve. Yet the reality was far different. North Vietnamese logistics were resilient. The Ho Chi Minh Trail adapted, snaking through jungles, rivers, and mountains. Villages were flattened, crops destroyed, infrastructure pulverized. Helicopters and B-52 bombers rained destruction on targets that were never truly decisive. The bombing campaigns continued for 3 years, dropping more ordnance on North Vietnam than had been deployed during the entire Second World War. Rolling Thunder was meant to break the enemy's will. Instead, it hardened it. By March 1965, the first U.S. combat troops landed in Da Nang to protect airbases, train armed troops, and support counterinsurgency operations. Within months, U.S. personnel in Vietnam surged from a few thousand advisors to over 180,000 combat troops. Cities became crowded with soldiers. Villagers fled areas of active fighting. Saigon, once a calm capital, now struggled under waves of refugees, corruption, and political uncertainty. From 1964 to 1967, the Viet Cong intensified operations. They launched ambushes, booby traps, and hit-and-run attacks. Armed troops, often poorly trained and poorly led, struggled to respond effectively. Conventional firepower proved inadequate. Napalm burned forests, but could not destroy the will of the people. Bombs could flatten a hamlet, but the insurgency was not a building to be razed, it was an idea, carried in the hearts of those determined to resist foreign control. By 1966, U.S. strategy relied heavily on search and destroy operations. Infantry units, often accompanied by helicopters, would sweep villages, engage suspected Viet Cong units, and return to bases. Casualties were high on both sides. Civilians were caught in the crossfire. The American military calculated success in body counts, a statistic measuring enemy losses. Yet this approach underestimated the adaptability and resilience of the Viet Cong. For every guerrilla killed, more emerged, recruited from sympathetic villages, from the north, or from those disillusioned with South Vietnam's government. The political situation in South Vietnam remained fragile. Following Diem's assassination, a series of short-lived governments came and went. Generals seized power only to be removed by coups or internal dissent. Johnson faced mounting pressure in Washington. Determined not to repeat Kennedy's caution, the fear of appearing weak, the specter of global communism drove him to escalate further. The culmination of this escalation came during the Tet Offensive in January 1968. During the Vietnamese Lunar New Year, Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces launched coordinated attacks on over 100 cities and towns across South Vietnam, including Saigon. The scale was unprecedented. The U.S. and ARVN forces eventually repelled the offensive, but the psychological impact was devastating. The Tet Offensive shattered the perception that victory was near. American public opinion began to turn. Distrust of government narratives surged. The war's legitimacy came under scrutiny. Victory in body counts had never equaled victory in hearts. Tet revealed the illusion of control. Every street, every hamlet, every village was a battlefield, and no measure of firepower could erase the will of a determined people. By the end of 1968, U.S. forces in Vietnam numbered over 500,000. Estimated Vietnamese military and civilian casualties exceeded 1 million. U.S. casualties surpassed 30,000 killed, with tens of thousands more wounded. Cities swelled with refugees. Villages lay in rubble. Jungles, once a backdrop of green serenity, became scarred by bombs, napalm, and defoliants. The war was no longer a distant Cold War proxy. It was immediate, brutal, and undeniable. Every decision, every escalation, every bombing raid was a choice between lives lost and a strategic gamble that offered no guarantees. The dream of a quick victory had vanished into smoke and fire. Vietnam had become a mirror of America's fears, ambitions, and miscalculations. The war had grown beyond advisors and limited engagements. It had become a full-scale conflict, testing not only military might but the resilience of nations, the patience of leaders, and the conscience of a generation. The Viet Cong endured, adapted, and persisted, knowing that the longest war is often fought in silence, among the people, in the hearts of those who cannot be conquered by fire alone. The story of Vietnam is not one of sudden upheaval, but of centuries stacked upon centuries of struggle, conquest, and survival. A land divided by rivers, mountains, and foreign ambitions, it has always been a place where the weight of history presses heavily on the present. The Red River Delta in the north and the Mekong Delta in the south cradle civilizations that rose and fell long before the West took notice. Three peoples, the Vietnamese in the north, the Cam in the central coastal regions, and the Khmer in the southern lowlands, carved kingdoms from rivers and forests, traded across seas, and defended their borders against invaders and empires alike. Colonial ambition arrived slowly, in the form of traders, missionaries, and armies. The Portuguese, Dutch, British, and French left marks on language, religion, and culture. Catholic missionaries from Portugal and later France sowed both faith and friction, provoking the wrath of emperors and offering justification for foreign intervention. By the mid-19th century, France had claimed Vietnam as a colony, carving the land into Tonkin, Annam, and Cochin China, weaving French laws, schools, and architecture into the ancient landscape. A new social order emerged. Landlords, bureaucrats, and urban elites gained advantage from collaboration, while peasants bore the brunt of taxation, forced labor, and displacement. Vietnam had long known war, yet the 20th century brought a new kind, a war that was global, ideological, and deeply personal. Ho Chi Minh, a nationalist molded by French education, world travel, and Marxist thought, rose from obscurity to leadership. He understood the power of organization, ideology, and the will of a people pushed to the edge. Returning from years abroad, he found a country occupied by foreign powers, suffering famine and oppression, longing for autonomy. Through the Viet Minh, he forged a resistance that combined military skill, political acumen, and deep connection to the land and its people. The Japanese occupation during World War I, followed by French attempts to reassert control, created a volatile stage. Millions starved while armies maneuvered, and loyalties shifted with survival. By 1945, Vietnam had entered a period of transformation. Ho Chi Minh declared independence in the north, yet the south remained contested, a patchwork of old monarchies, emergent leaders, and foreign interests. The United States, initially an ally in the fight against Japan, soon found itself entangled in the struggle for influence, misreading nationalism for communism, local resistance for global threat. The First Indochina War ended in 1954 at Dien Bien Phu, where the French faced a humiliating defeat. Geneva divided the country along the 17th parallel, giving North Vietnam to Ho Chi Minh and creating a fragile, U.S.-supported government in the south under Ngo Dinh Diem. A fragile ceasefire masked deep unrest. In villages and cities alike, allegiances were tested. Guerrillas infiltrated, insurgents recruited, and civilians navigated the deadly balance between survival and resistance. From these origins, the war escalated, slowly at first, then inexorably. Advisors became soldiers. Bombing campaigns became land invasions. Each decision by Washington, each reaction by Hanoi, each act of courage or terror in the villages of Vietnam fed the machine of conflict. It was a war of strategy and ideology, yes, but also a war of human endurance, moral compromise, and tragic miscalculation. The seeds of catastrophe had been sown long before the first American boots hit the ground. 100 years of colonialism, decades of civil strife, and generations of resistance created a nation prepared to endure more than most could imagine. And yet, as America ramped up its commitment, the true nature of the struggle remained misunderstood. The war would not be won by firepower alone. It would be fought in hearts, in villages, along rivers, in the dense jungles and open fields, in the minds of men and women who had no intention of surrendering. The stage was set. A world once distant would become intimately involved. Decisions made in Washington, Paris, and Saigon would reverberate across oceans and generations. The story of Vietnam, of its people, its warriors, its leaders, and its invaders, had only just begun. And the consequences of that beginning would be felt for decades, shaping not just a nation, but the conscience of the world.